A gray patrol car made its way through the small town's evening shadows. Inside, under the neon lights, Sergeant Will Cartwright cursed his short vacation, which had turned into a series of minor irritations. Little did he know that this night would be the turning point that would turn his life and the life of another woman upside down. Nia stood on the street corner, confident, with a deep gaze that could discern the truth. It had been a long day, and she had just finished her work at the district attorney's office, but the evening promised to be even better: dinner with friends and laughter that could erase fatigue. She couldn't know that she was being watched closely at that moment. "Hey, you!" the sergeant's sharp voice rang out. "Come here." Nia, feeling the tension growing, turned around. Why was he addressing her specifically? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her heart began to beat faster when, without waiting for an answer, he stepped towards her with a confident smile that had already changed to a serious expression. "Do you have any identification on you?" he asked, leaning too close to her, as if that would help him see her true nature. Nia felt the fear growing, like a dark shadow enveloping her. She wasn't just a woman on the street, she was a prosecutor, but in his eyes, she was just another suspect. "What do you think about this? Write in the comments. What is your name and where are you watching this video from? Your words and opinions are really important to us, and we want to know how you feel in this conversation. Each of you is a part of our story, and your comments help us promote our channel. We really appreciate your support, because it is you who inspire us to create new materials and discuss important topics." As he continued to watch over Nia, the sergeant was unaware that his actions that night would not only change their lives, but would also create a wave that would run throughout the city, causing people to question what justice truly means. "Your presence makes us stronger. Every comment, every word you say enriches our community. We want you to know, you are important to us not only as viewers, but also as participants in this dialogue. Without you, our work would not make sense. Let's create a space together where every opinion matters. Enjoy watching." A patrol car slid through the small town's evening shadows, its bright lights cutting through the darkness like a sword. Inside was Sergeant Will Cartwright, who, despite his rank, was consumed with inner turmoil. He had heard too many stories of police brutality, and though he had never been a part of it, he felt that in every night of shadow and uncertainty, there might be a dark truth lurking. That evening, his attention was drawn to a young black woman standing on the street corner. She was dressed in a simple but elegant dress that emphasized her confidence. Nia, as she was called, had come from work, where she once again defended the rights of her clients as a prosecutor. Every day she faced bureaucracy and bias, but this did not break her spirit. She knew that she was fighting for justice, and this is what gave her strength. Sergeant Cartwright stopped the car and stepped out onto the street. His eyes didn't just glance at her face, they assessed her as if she were a threat. In that moment, preconceived notions kicked in, plunging into the deep roots of racism ingrained in society. He strode toward Nia. "Hey, you!" he called, breaking her out of her thoughts. Nia turned around, her heart beating faster. Why was he talking to her like she'd done something? Was she experiencing that old, familiar feeling again, where the color of your skin determined your place in society? "Come here. Are you okay?" Nia asked, trying to remain calm. Her voice sounded confident, although anxiety was growing inside. Cartwright, without waiting for an explanation, stepped closer, giving himself confidence. He didn't know who she was, and he didn't care. In his mind, she was just another suspect, and his job was to keep those under control. "Do you have documents?" he said, his tone demanding. Nia felt fear coil around her, like a boa constrictor tightening around her neck. She knew she had to remain calm. She was a prosecutor, but that meant nothing to this man standing before her. "I'm a prosecutor. I don't have to show any documents," she replied, trying to sound confident, but Cartwright was not impressed. He continued to look at her suspiciously, as if he was looking for a reason to arrest her. "It doesn't matter," he said, and there was a roughness in his voice, as if he was enjoying his power. "I need to check your papers." Nia felt anger begin to boil in her chest. She couldn't believe that in the 21st century, in a country that prided itself on its rights, she would have to face prejudice and injustice again. "You have no right to detain me," she said, taking a step back, and at that moment her voice became louder, more confident, but Cartwright seemed only to steal his resolve. "Call for backup," he said into the radio, not taking his eyes off her. He sensed that Nia was going to bring trouble upon herself, and that gave him strength. Nia knew her situation couldn't be worse. She was standing alone, facing a police officer who had already made up his mind. Fear gripped her, but at the same time, her determination to fight grew. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about fighting for the truth, to show everyone that the world was still full of bias. Clouds began to gather over the city, and soon the weather changed, as did her fate that evening. The silent witnesses, the passers-by who had watched, looked away, unwilling to intervene. Even as arguments flared within them, Nia knew their silence spoke louder than any words. The sergeant was about to take a step forward when another policeman approached them. This new officer looked slightly older and was wearing a uniform that seemed more casual to him. He glanced at Nia and seemed to notice her tension. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice a little softer, but there was already a note of wariness in it. Cartwright, not wanting to look weak, explained the situation, pointing at Nia. "She refuses to show her documents," he said, trying to justify his actions. Nia, full of determination, said, "I am a prosecutor, and you have no right to do this. I am not going to allow you to violate my rights." Her words echoed across the empty street, and for a moment everyone froze. The tension in the air was palpable even to those watching. "Let's calm down and talk normally," the new officer said, trying to defuse the situation, but Nia's inner fear was already overshadowing everything. At that moment, she realized that this night would be a turning point not only for her, but for many others. She didn't know what was waiting for her ahead, but one thing was clear: she could no longer remain in the shadows. Her fate intersected with the fate of all those who have ever felt defenseless, who knew what racism and prejudice were. She realized that she had to fight not only for herself, but for everyone who was waiting for justice. Through the darkness of this confrontation, her voice was like a ray of light trying to break through the darkness, and with every second, with every phrase she spoke, she realized that the world around them was not simple. It was complex and full of contradictions, where the color of one's skin determined one's fate. This night was just beginning, and she knew it was just the beginning of a fight that could change everything. The clash outside continued to escalate. Nia felt anger and fear mingle within her, creating a powerful vortex of emotion. Sergeant Cartwright's words continued to resonate in her mind. "You have no right." She knew this night was more than a personal battle. It was a symbolic war against a system that still twisted notions of justice. As the second officer approached them, Nia noticed the doubt on his face. He looked like he was trying to assess the situation, but Cartwright's gaze left him with no choice. He was ready to act. "Sergeant, maybe we should approach this differently," the new officer said, his voice a little softer, but still cautious. "We don't know the full situation." "What's there to figure out?" Cartwright exclaimed, his eyes blazing with aggression. "She's already created a problem. If she'd just shown the papers, nothing would have happened." Nia felt her shoulders tense at the accusation. There was determination in her eyes, and she knew she had to raise her voice. "I'm not the problem, Sergeant. The problem is the bias that makes you view me as a suspect simply because of the color of my skin. I stand here with rights just like any other citizen, and I demand that you respect them." Her words were once again echoed by the silent witnesses, of whom there were several. Their gazes were full of tension, but most of them did not dare to intervene, as if the fear of the police was stronger than the fear for the woman standing in front of them. This fear left Nia alone, and with each passing moment it became more difficult for her. Cartwright seemed unwilling to budge. His confidence came from the bias that had long been part of his professional persona. He stepped closer to Nia, and despite his efforts to sound confident, there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "I'm just doing my job. You know how it is. Every now and then we get suspicious, and your reaction only confirms it." "Suspicion based on what?" Nia cried, her voice shaking with anger. "Based on the fact that I'm a black woman on this corner? Based on the fact that you think you can abuse your power?" Cartwright, not expecting such a turn of events, retreated a little, but his aggression only grew. He seemed to seek support from his colleague, but the latter, watching Nia, was increasingly hesitant. "We can resolve this peacefully," the new officer said, his gaze focused on Nia. "Let's just talk." Nia felt the tension building, but at the same time, hope was rising in her. Perhaps this officer could see the truth and help her. She nodded, trying to calm her voice. "I'm just going home. I didn't do anything wrong. Please, just let me go and we'll all forget about this." Cartwright, feeling that he was losing control of the situation, tried to save face. "I can't just let you go," he turned to the new officer. "I'm doing my job. If she doesn't show her papers, I have to detain her." Nia felt the anger rising inside her again. This wasn't just an outrage, it was a misunderstanding, an invisible division that had been running through their entire history. She knew these stereotypes wouldn't disappear overnight, but she was ready to fight. "You have my prosecutor card," she said, and though she knew it was inappropriate, it was the only thing she had. She pulled out her phone and opened her app. "Look at it. You'll see I'm not the enemy." Cartwright glanced at the screen, his expression wavering between doubt and anger, but instead of showing any humanity, he persisted. "It doesn't change anything. If you can't provide documents, I'm obliged to detain you." The world around them became unbearably silent, only the sounds of distant traffic reminding them of life beyond this dark moment. Nia knew she couldn't just give up. She knew this wasn't just her fight, it was the fight of everyone who had ever faced this injustice. "I will not let you ruin my life based on your bias," she said, her voice full of confidence and strength she had not felt until that moment. "I stand up for not only my rights, but the rights of everyone who has ever been unheard. This is wrong, and I will not remain silent." Cartwright seemed confused. There was uncertainty on his face. He had not expected such fortitude, and it was beginning to worry him, but hatred still seethed in his soul, and he stepped forward. "You're still under arrest," he growled, and at that moment his hand reached for the handcuffs. But Nia wasn't going to give up. Her eyes were sparkling and her determination was burning inside. She knew that this moment would decide not only her fate, but the fate of many others. "You can't do this," she screamed. "I'm not a criminal, I'm a prosecutor." Cartwright paused for a moment, as if that sentence had stopped him. Doubt had entered his mind. What if she was right? What if her words actually mattered? But he quickly dismissed that thought. There was no room for doubt in his world, especially when it came to his power. In his eyes, she was just another problem that needed to be solved. Meanwhile, the new officer, watching this scene, began to realize that the situation was getting out of control. He realized that they could cross a line, and then the consequences would be serious not only for Nia, but for both of them. "Let's take a break," he said, trying to intervene. "Just listen to her." But Cartwright wouldn't listen. His anger was boiling, and he was ready to act. He approached Nia, and there was no longer a drop of doubt in his eyes. "You are not leaving here until I see your papers," he said, his voice becoming rough and insistent. Nia stood before him, aware that this could end very badly. Not only fear, but also determination burned in her chest. She knew that this moment could be a turning point, and the words of truth sounded in her voice again. "You are violating my rights. You are violating the law." And then, just as she was about to turn and leave, she saw a nearby onlooker pull out his phone. She knew this moment could be recorded, that his words could be used against Cartwright. That was her hope, to record what was happening, to record the bias and injustice, so that one day it could be addressed. And in that moment, when her fear and determination met, she realized that this moment was important not only for her, but for all those who had remained silent while their rights were violated. She felt a power awaken in her body that went deeper than simple fear. It was the power of justice. Nia felt the world around her slowly dissolve into thin air, leaving only her and Sergeant Cartwright. His face was twisted in anger, and his hand, reaching for the cuffs, looked like a thunderstorm ready to crash down on her. She knew that every moment was full of consequences, and fear squeezed her heart in a vice. She couldn't let him win, couldn't let her become another victim of this system. "You're going to break the law," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "You're going to arrest a prosecutor who protects the rights of citizens. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous." Cartwright didn't react. He was lost in his thoughts, completely focused on doing his duty. In his eyes, she was just another suspect, another face in the long list of people he had detained. But Nia was more than that. She was a symbol of the fight against a system that had long ignored the rights of black people. Nervous energy permeated the air. The witnesses began to approach, their phones flashing, and Nia felt the growing fear heighten her senses. She couldn't be quiet, couldn't allow herself to be silenced. "You have to stop," she said, her voice rising. "This is not only wrong, it's racist. I'm not standing here because I'm a criminal. I'm standing here because you don't see me as a human being because I'm black. This is wrong." But the moment she said those words, Cartwright took a sharp step towards her. His face was distorted with hatred. He did not want to hear the truth. He was ready to arrest her, without thinking about the consequences. "If you don't want me to arrest you, just give me your papers," he said, clutching the handcuffs in his hand as if they were the key to his power. "You have no right to arrest me," Nia screamed, her voice ringing out like a gunshot. "You are acting out of prejudice and fear, and it is a disgrace to you and to the entire system." In that moment, she felt like she wasn't just fighting for her freedom, but for the freedom of everyone who had ever suffered from racism. This moment, they could capture it on video, and it could be proof of what was really going on in society, but there was still a sense that this truth could be ignored, as it had been so many times before. Nia's heart began to beat faster as she watched Cartwright's anger grow. He wasn't going to give in. She knew that these handcuffs weren't just physical restraints. They were symbolic of the system of oppression that still operated in her country. "I am a prosecutor, and you must understand that your behavior is illegal," she said, trying to impress, but her words simply flew past his ears. He took another step toward her, and she felt fear growing in her body, but anger was boiling stronger. "You're not a prosecutor, you're just another black woman who breaks the law," he said, and there was hatred in his voice that hit her like a fist. The words hit her like a blow, and she realized this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever felt defenseless. Cartwright leaned closer to her, and in his eyes she saw fear and hatred entwined together. She couldn't let him destroy her spirit, couldn't let him make her a victim. "You have no right to judge me by the color of my skin," she screamed, her voice like thunder piercing the silence. "You have no right to determine who I am or what I can do." The crowd gathered around them began to whisper, their eyes darting between Cartwright and Nia. This moment was more than just a conflict between police officer and citizen. It was a fight for rights, for humanity, for being heard. Now they were on the edge. Nia knew that this night could end in two ways. Either she would emerge victorious or she would become another victim of this system. But she knew that she had no right to give up. She couldn't let this policeman take her life. "I'm not just a prosecutor. I'm a mother, a sister, a daughter. I'm a voice for those who can't speak," she said, her eyes full of tears. "I fight for justice, for everyone who's been through this before me." At that moment, Nia noticed how the faces of the people in the crowd began to change. Some of them nodded, others began to encourage her. These looks gave her strength. She felt supported. She was not alone. Cartwright felt his confidence begin to waver. His hand, still clutching the cuffs, trembled, and for a moment he hesitated. He realized that he was not just up against one woman, he was up against an entire culture, an entire wave of resentment that was just beginning to grow. "I won't tolerate this," he shouted, his voice like a beast's roar. "You are under arrest for resisting." Nia's heart began to pound in her chest, but she wasn't about to give up. "You can't stop me," she said with a force she didn't expect. "We won't be silent. We'll fight." The crowd around them, watching this confrontation, began to slowly fill with anger. People began to take to the streets, their voices merging into one. This was not just a spectacle, it was a movement, an awakening that was gathering all those who had ever suffered from racism. "We'll support you," someone from the crowd shouted, and it encouraged Nia. She realized that this wasn't just her fight anymore, but the fight of everyone who had ever felt oppressed. But Cartwright, realizing he was losing control, took another step toward her. He raised his hand, and in that moment, Nia felt time slow down. She saw the hatred blaze in his eyes, and she knew he was ready to take it a step further. "You don't understand what you're getting into," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "I'll arrest you, and no one will be able to protect you." But in response to his threat, Nia felt her power only grow. She knew that if not now, then when? If she didn't take this step, who would? "I stand for truth, for justice, and no one can stop me," she screamed, and her voice was full of determination, full of strength. "We all deserve to be heard." The headlights, penetrating the darkness, illuminated the scene, and Nia realized that this moment was more than just a clash. This was a fight for rights. This was a fight for change. This was a fight for humanity. With each passing second, the crowd became more engaged. People began to support her, and she felt their energy flowing through her. This moment was important not only for her, but for everyone who has ever felt oppressed. She was not alone, and that gave her strength. We cannot remain silent, she screamed, and this spell echoed throughout the streets. We will fight for our rights. And in that moment, Nia realized that this wasn't just her story, it was the story of everyone who had ever been left unsaid. It was a story that needed to be told, and she was willing to fight for it, even if it meant risking everything. Nia's heart filled with determination and the lights of hope lit up her eyes. She knew her fight was just beginning, but it was a fight she was ready to fight. And that night, Nia stood like a rock in the center of the raging storm. She knew her words could change the course of events, but she also knew she could face Cartwright's wrath. His face, twisted with hatred and prejudice, was before her eyes, and in that moment she realized she wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting for justice. The crowd around them grew larger, and people began to shout out words of encouragement as they watched the standoff. Nia felt her fear fading, replaced by strength and determination. Her heart beat in time with this manifesto, and she knew that the most important thing now was not to give in. "You still think you can shut me up?" she said, her voice like a bell ringing over the noise. "I stand for the truth. I'm a prosecutor, and you have to remember that your job is to protect people, not intimidate them." Cartwright, seeing her confidence grow, felt his control slipping. He pressed his lips together, his eyes blazing with anger. He took a step towards Nia, his hands still tightly gripping the cuffs, ready to fall on her at any moment. "You shouldn't say that," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You're in no position to dictate to me what to do. You have the right to remain silent, but I can arrest you for disobedience." At that moment, Nia realized that they were on the verge of an explosion. She saw the crowd go silent, their eyes moving between her and Cartwright, waiting to see how this would all end. It was like a taut string, ready to snap at any moment. "This is not disobedience, this is resistance to injustice," she screamed, her voice thundering in the silence. "I refuse to be a victim of your prejudice. I refuse to let you arrest me without cause." As if in response to her screams, the crowd began to close in around them, as if forming a shield of people who could not remain indifferent to what was happening. Some began to cheer her on, others pulled out their phones to record this story unfolding before their eyes. "You're not alone," one of the women in the crowd shouted, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "We're behind you." This statement, full of support and unity, gave Nia strength. She felt a wave of energy rising within her, but at the same time, Cartwright clenched his fists, his face becoming more and more aggressive. "Get them out," he shouted at his partner, his voice full of rage. "Keep them away." But the second officer hesitated, his gaze sliding to Nia, a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just a routine stop, this was a conflict that went deeper than a simple detention. "Sergeant, maybe we should just let her go," he said, his voice becoming more cautious. "Maybe we should just talk and resolve this peacefully." Cartwright turned to him with hatred, his eyes burning. "Are you crazy? She needs to understand who's boss here. If I don't do it now, everyone will think I'm weak." Nia felt Cartwright losing control of the situation. This was her chance. She knew that every word she said could be decisive. "I'm not a criminal, I'm a prosecutor," she screamed again, her voice piercing the air like an arrow. "I'm standing here because you don't see me as a human being, you only see the color of my skin." With each sentence, Nia felt her confidence grow, her voice booming, capturing the crowd's attention and support. She had become a symbol, not just someone who had been wrongly arrested, she was someone who had defied the system. The crowd became more and more active. People began to shout slogans, their voices merged into one. It was like a wave, overflowing everything around. The energy of the demonstration turned into a street fight for rights. "We demand justice," they shouted, their voices sounding as one. But Cartwright was still focused on Nia. He felt his power crumbling. In that moment, he realized that she was more than just an intruder. She represented everything he hated, everything he fought against. "You all don't understand that this is not just a conversation," he said in a compressed voice, his eyes flashing. "This is a matter of honor. I must arrest you to show everyone that I am in the right place." Nia saw the anger building in his eyes, and in that moment she knew he might do something unthinkable. She knew she had to act before the situation got out of control. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I will fight for my truth. You cannot take me by force, because I am not only for myself, but for all those who were wrongfully arrested, for those who were driven into a corner." These words, filled with anger and determination, awakened the people in the crowd. They began to cheer her on, their cries growing louder, growing like an approaching storm. "For Nia," they shouted, and this word became a slogan, a symbol of protest. Cartwright saw the situation spiraling out of control. His face turned red with rage and he took another step toward Nia, trying to put physical distance between them. "Take her away. I'm not going to stand for this," he shouted, waving the handcuffs as if they were a weapon. But instead, the crowd surrounded Nia, forming a barrier between her and the policeman. They weren't going to just stand there and watch his hatred try to destroy their collective strength. People started shouting, their voices filling the air. "We won't let you do this," one of the women said, her voice full of determination. At that moment, Cartwright, as if possessed, rushed forward, his hand shot to the handcuffs and he cried out, "I'll arrest you." But when he tried to grab Nia, the crowd reacted instantly. People stepped forward to protect her, and his attempted arrest turned into chaos. A commotion erupted around them, shouts and cries intertwined into one sound. Cartwright, realizing he had lost control, tried to squeeze the cuffs again, but this time, Nia wasn't going to stay silent. She knew this moment wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever felt oppressed. "We are not afraid," she cried, her voice like thunder. "We demand justice." Cartwright stood like a stone statue, but Nia knew that this was not the end. This was only the beginning. She felt the energy building in her body, and taking a step forward, she said, "I will fight. I am not just a prosecutor. I am a voice for those who have been driven into a corner." Cartwright, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, suddenly realized that the only thing that could save him was the force he always used. He stepped toward her, but his face, full of hatred, suddenly began to express something else: fear. Sirens sounded behind them. It was backup. Police cars were cutting through the crowd, surrounding them. This could be catastrophic. Nia felt the tension building, but she knew she couldn't just walk away. She couldn't become another victim, another number on that dreadful list. "This isn't the end," she screamed as more police officers began to gather around them. "This is just the beginning." The policemen's silhouettes became more and more visible, and Nia realized that the fight was just beginning. She had to continue. She had to protect not only herself, but all those who needed her voice. The crowd continued to shout, their ranks growing denser, and Nia knew that there was power in this rebellious spirit of the people, power that they must use to challenge a system that had long forgotten what justice was. With a heart full of determination and hope, Nia raised her hands as if calling for unity. She knew that they could change the situation if they worked together. "We're all here to support each other," she said, her voice like a prayer. "Together, we can change this." And in that moment, amidst the chaos and fear, Nia became a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever fought against injustice. She knew that tonight, she hadn't just encountered a cop, she had encountered a system, and that system needed to change. With every word spoken, every voice raised, she knew that they could change the future, that the fight for justice was just beginning. Cartwright felt his anger begin to boil, clenching his fists. He couldn't understand why the crowd had gathered around Nia, why she was suddenly the center of their attention. This wasn't just a protest, it was a riot. He felt his power slipping away, his control of the situation, and it fueled his hatred. "Get this crowd out of the way or I'll take action," he yelled at his partner, who clearly didn't know how to react to everything that was happening. Nia knew he just needed to blow off some steam, and that his threats were just fear. She had to use that to her advantage. "You're on the wrong side of history, Sergeant," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "You can keep trying to bully us, but we're not going away quietly. We are the change, and we're not going to back down." Nia felt the people around her supporting her, their voices merging into a single chorus. They were becoming one force, and it gave her confidence. But Cartwright, seeing how the situation was spiraling out of control, shrank even more. He was like a sullen predator, preparing to attack. "It's none of your business," he said, his voice threatening, as if he was trying to intimidate not just Nia but the entire crowd. "You all don't understand that you're preventing me from doing my duty. You're just a bunch of slackers who don't know what order is." The crowd responded with shouts. They were ready to fight, ready to stand up for their rights. Nia felt the tension rising, her heart beating in unison with the rhythm of the demonstration. She knew that if they didn't stop Cartwright now, the consequences could be dire. "This is not order. This is racism," she screamed. "You just don't want to see what you're doing. You choose to ignore the truth because it doesn't suit you." At that moment, Cartwright, filled with rage, rushed forward. He grabbed Nia by the shoulder as if he wanted to tear her apart. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he said, his face twisted in anger. "You're just another statistic. I can do anything to you, and no one can stop me." As if to underscore his point, another police car pulled up around the corner and more officers climbed out. They were dressed in uniform, their faces hidden by helmets. It raised the tension to the limit. "What's going on here?" One of the new cops, tall and muscular, looked at the crowd with distrust. He clearly didn't understand what exactly had happened. "We are defending our truth," one of the women in the crowd shouted. "She is not a criminal, she is a prosecutor, and she was wrongfully arrested." The cop looked at Nia, and understanding flickered in his eyes, but Cartwright wasn't going to stand for it. He turned his attention back to Nia, as if there was an invisible arc of tension between them. "I'm not going to argue with you," he said, his voice like thunder. "Do you think that your status as a prosecutor will protect you from the law? I can arrest you simply because I decide to do so." At that moment, something inside Nia broke. She felt everything around her spinning, and her anger turned to fury. She couldn't let this police officer take away her voice, take away her right to fight for what was right. "You can't just ignore the law," she screamed, her voice rising to a shriek. "You can't use your uniform as a weapon against innocent people. You can't bully people just because they look different." Cartwright clenched his fists, his face pale with rage. He knew that Nia was the real threat now. Her words filled the space, creating an aura of power around her that he could never have. "Shut up," he shouted, and suddenly, like the onset of a storm, there was a cracking sound. He pulled out his club and stepped toward her, as if he was ready to unleash his full wrath on her. The crowd, sensing the tension, took a step back, but Nia couldn't back down. She couldn't. This was her moment of confrontation with the system that was trying to suppress her. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice hard as steel. "I know who I am, and I won't let you tell me who I should be." Cartwright froze, his anger momentarily overtaken by fear. Just as he was about to take another step, Nia saw one of the police officers who had arrived to help cast an accusing glance at her. She knew his words could be decisive. "Look, Cartwright, maybe we should stop this," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "We don't want this to turn into anything more." But Cartwright just snorted, his anger growing. He wasn't going to let anyone interrupt him. Nia could feel the whole situation getting more and more heated, and in that moment she realized that maybe the only thing that could stop Cartwright was his own fears. "You're afraid of me," she said, her voice ringing in the silence. "You're afraid that I might tell the truth, that I might be who I want to be. You're afraid that no one will listen to you anymore." Cartwright lunged forward again, but this time the crowd reacted. People raised their hands as if to protect Nia, their voices merging into a single cry. This was not just a protest. This was a fight for truth, for human dignity, for the right to be heard. "We're all here," one of the women shouted. "We won't leave you in trouble." And in that moment, as Nia looked into Cartwright's eyes, she realized that the fight was just beginning. Her heart beat in unison with the rhythm of the crowd, and a flame of hope flared up in her soul. Cartwright, realizing that his control had finally slipped, took one last step back. Nia saw him trying to collect his thoughts, his anger no longer so obvious. "I am the law," he shouted, but his words no longer sounded so confident. It was like a cry of despair, like the cry of a man who suddenly realized that his power was just an illusion. The crowd began to move forward, and Nia, feeling that this was the moment for her to take the lead, raised her hand. "We are not afraid," she cried, her voice echoing through the crowd. "We are the force, we are the change." The crowd responded, their cries sounding like a single entity. Nia felt this unification of people turning into a powerful current, ready to break the chains of hatred and prejudice. "We will fight for justice," she said, and this statement became the spark that lit the fire. Every word, every movement, became an act of resistance. She knew that today she was not just defending herself, she was defending all those who suffered from injustice, from hatred, from prejudice. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, and in that moment, Nia realized this wasn't just a fight for herself, this was a fight for everyone who had ever felt oppressed, for everyone who had been wrongfully arrested, for those who had never had the chance to speak their truth. "I am the prosecutor," she said, her voice like a spell. "I am here to say that we are not afraid, that we will not remain silent." Cartwright's gaze never left Nia's. His face was twisted in anger, and in that moment she realized that he would do anything to maintain his power, even if it meant intimidating an innocent person. She felt the fear creeping into her soul, a shadow looming over her, and suddenly it was all too real. The crowd continued to scream, but in their eyes, Nia saw not only support, but also fear. What if this all ended badly? What if she became another victim, another statistic in a long list of racial injustices? The thought of her life being ruined by one police officer's decision cut through her like a sharp knife. "You all don't understand anything," Cartwright shouted, his voice like thunder. "I'm here to maintain order, and if that means arresting this woman, so be it." Nia felt her surroundings spin. She knew that her status as a prosecutor, her education, and her voice meant nothing to this man. To him, she was just another black woman, easily ignored and bullied. The realization hit her like a cold wind in the face. "I didn't do anything to you," she said, her voice shaking with fear, but she tried to sound confident. "I'm not a criminal. You're just using your power against innocent people." Cartwright just smirked, and it was a smirk full of disdain. He stepped closer, his club glinting in the street lights, and Nia felt a tingle of anxiety rise in her chest. "I can't hear you," he screamed, hatred burning in his eyes. "You're just another black woman who thinks she can defy the law." Just as Cartwright was about to take a step towards her, Nia felt someone from the crowd reach out and shout, "Don't touch her, she didn't do anything." Cartwright's rage. He turned toward the crowd as if he were an enraged animal ready to defend his territory. "I'm warning you," he said, his voice becoming hoarse. "If any of you interfere, I won't hesitate to use force." Nia watched as the crowd froze, as if they were stopped by an invisible wall. She felt like this whole situation was turning against her, that she was becoming a victim in a game where the stakes were too high. She couldn't let this happen, but what could she do? "You think your uniform will protect you from the consequences?" she said, trying to remain stoic. "You can't just break the law and think you'll get away with it." But Cartwright just smirked, his eyes blazing with malice. He turned to her, and in that moment she saw his anger grow, as if he was enjoying what was happening. "You don't understand," he said with icy calm. "I can do whatever I want with you, and no one can stop me. You can't talk to me about justice when you don't know what it is." As if to confirm his words, one of the police officers he had called for help earlier cast a displeased glance at Nia. It was like a blow to the chest. She realized that even those who were supposed to protect her were beginning to doubt her innocence. The crowd began to whisper, and Nia felt her heart beat faster. She knew that if this situation got out of control, she could lose everything: her career, her freedom, her life. "This isn't just a case," she said, her voice no longer as confident. "This isn't just an arrest. This is racism. This is bias. You think your uniform makes you untouchable, but it doesn't." Cartwright stepped closer to her, and Nia felt the air around her grow heavy. A feeling of hopelessness rose inside her. She was a prosecutor. She knew the laws. She knew how the system was supposed to work. But in this moment, she was just a woman who stood to lose everything. "I won't listen to your complaints," he said, his voice a threat. "Do you think your status will protect you? I'll do whatever I want to you, and no one will stop me." Nia felt her shoulders tighten, as if the world had fallen on her head. She was a victim of a system that didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her. In that moment, as Cartwright prepared to step forward, a thought flashed through her mind: how easy it is to become a victim, how easy it is to lose everything because of prejudice and hatred. The crowd around her began to grow nervous, and Nia knew that she had to fight, even if she had to do it alone. Her voice was her weapon, and she knew that her words could be the one that changed the course of events. "I will fight for myself, for everyone who feels helpless," she screamed, her voice sounding with new strength, as if the truth itself had found an outlet in her. "I will not let you make me a victim." But Cartwright only smirked in response. He stepped forward, and in that moment, Nia felt fear wash over her. She knew it could all be over in an instant, that she could lose herself in this fight. "I'm arresting you, no matter who you are," he said, his hand reaching for her wrist. Nia felt the world around her freeze. The second his hand touched her skin, her heart stopped. She knew it wasn't just physical contact. It was a statement that her life, her freedom, everything she had fought for could be destroyed in an instant. The crowd around them screamed, and in that moment, Nia knew this was her last chance. Her fight would not end with her arrest. This was just the first page in a long story they would all write together. "I'm not a victim," she screamed, her voice filling the air like a thunderstorm. "I won't let you break me." And in that moment, as she stood there, fighting for her truth, she realized that her fight was not just for her, but for everyone who had ever suffered from racism and bias. She was not going to give up, even when things seemed hopeless. A fire blazed inside her, and despite the fear, despite the threats, she knew that this was only the beginning of her fight. Nia felt fear squeeze her heart, as if a heavy stone had fallen on her. Cartwright continued to hold her wrist, his hand cold and cruel, like the very pressure of the system that had oppressed her for so long. Many people had gathered around her, but they were only spectators, watching her become a victim, and the feeling of loneliness was terrible. "I'm not a criminal," she screamed again, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm a prosecutor. I'm here to protect people, not to be one of your victims." But Cartwright only smirked, and in his eyes Nia saw only contempt. He wasn't going to listen to her, wasn't going to see her. To him, she was just another black woman who, in his opinion, should know her place. "Your job doesn't matter when it comes to the law," he said, and there was a satisfaction in his voice, as if he was enjoying what was happening. "You were just adding fuel to the fire." Nia felt her inner world crumble. Spectators began to gather around her, and she knew they were watching her humiliation. Every shout, every comment from the crowd reminded her of how vulnerable she was, how easy it was to fall victim to a system that chose to ignore the truth. "This isn't just an arrest," she continued, her voice growing more desperate. "This is racism. This is prejudice. I'm here to fight for justice, but you won't give me a chance." At that moment, a woman from the crowd approached them, her eyes full of concern. "Listen, we know who you are. We're here to support you," she said, her voice filled with hope. But Cartwright only grinned. "And what will you do?" he said, and there was contempt in his voice. "Do you think that your screams will change anything? I can arrest you all." Nia felt anger rise in her. She couldn't let this cop take away her power, her voice, her chance to fight for what was right. She couldn't be a victim of his bias. "I'm not afraid," she cried, her voice a challenge. "I'm here to fight, and I won't give up." Cartwright's grip on her wrist tightened, and Nia felt the bones beneath his hand begin to ache. Her inner voice screamed for help, but she knew she couldn't back down. She wasn't just there for herself, she was there for everyone who had ever faced such injustice. "You can't arrest me without cause," she said, trying to remain calm. "I demand to be released." But Cartwright just stared at her, as if deciding whether to continue this game. He didn't care what she said, and that was terrifying. Nia knew her voice didn't matter to him. He didn't want to hear the truth, didn't want to see her as an equal. There was a commotion around her and the crowd became even more aggressive. People started chanting her name, raising their hands in support. But this only angered Cartwright. He glared at them, his face contorted with anger. "Step back," he shouted, his voice a command. "I'm not going to let you interfere with my work." Nia saw the other police officers standing behind him start to get nervous. They didn't know how to react to the situation, and that gave her hope. But at the same time, she knew that this could lead to even more aggression. "You have no right to violence," one of the women in the crowd shouted. "We are here to defend the truth." But Cartwright, seeing his power beginning to crumble, pulled Nia sharply toward the patrol car. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, and fear came over her again like a dark cloud. In that moment, she realized that this could end badly: her arrest, her life in humiliation, her future in jeopardy. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice sounding like despair. "I'm not your victim." But Cartwright only pulled her roughly closer to the car. Ignoring her words, Nia felt her body begin to shake with fear, her world crumbling around her. She knew that in the eyes of others she had become a victim, that her life would never be the same again. "No one will save you," he said, his voice a threat. "I will do to you what I want, and you will not be able to do anything about it." At that moment, she saw the face of one of the spectators, and that face was full of horror. She realized that there was a fire of hope burning in her eyes. but the fear still remained. She knew that if she did not show strength now, she could become a victim not only of Cartwright, but of the entire system that had never allowed her to be herself. "I will not give up," she screamed, her voice piercing the atmosphere. "I will fight for myself and for everyone who has ever suffered such injustice." But Cartwright just grinned, his face like a predator enjoying its prey. He pulled her toward the car, and in that moment, Nia felt everything being taken away from her dignity, her voice, her future. "I will not remain silent," she said with renewed vigor. "I will make you hear the truth." And the moment he opened the door of the patrol car, Nia felt everything around her spinning. She knew that this might be the end, but she also knew that there was a strength in her heart that no one could take away. With every word she spoke, she became more determined. She couldn't let this cop victimize her. She knew that if she didn't stand up for herself now, she would forever be in the shadows, and that would be far worse than any arrest. "I will fight," she screamed, her voice sounding like her last breath. "I will not let you break me." And as the car door slammed shut, Nia knew this fight was just beginning. A fire ignited inside her. She wasn't just a prosecutor. She wasn't just a black woman. She was a symbol of the fight for truth, and no one could take that away. Even when she became a victim, her spirit remained unbroken. She knew that despite all the adversity, her voice would be heard, and this story, this fight, would be a wake-up call for anyone who has ever faced prejudice and racism. She wasn't going to give up. When the patrol car door slammed shut, Nia found herself in a darkened car, where not only physical reality but also the oppression of the cop was pressing down on her. Cartwright, noticing that she hadn't broken down, looked even more aggressive. His face was contorted with rage, his eyes gleaming with hatred as he opened the door again and glared at her as if she were an unwanted guest. "You think your degree and your status as a prosecutor will save you?" he said with disdain, his voice a threat. "You're just another black woman who thinks she can challenge the system. I'm going to teach you a lesson you won't forget." Nia felt her heart tighten with fear, but she tried not to show weakness. She knew she had to stay strong, that her voice mattered, even if everyone around her tried to silence her. "I'm not afraid of you, Cartwright," she said, trying to remain calm. "I know what I'm doing, and I won't let you intimidate me." The policeman seemed only to be angered by her answer. He leaned closer, his eyes glittering with fire and contempt. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he said with a smirk. "I can do anything to you, and no one can save you. You're just a little black woman, no value in this system." His words cut like a knife, and Nia felt a dark wave of hatred wash over her. She knew these insults were part of a system that was trying to suppress her, but she couldn't allow herself to give in. "You are wrong," she cried, her voice taking on new notes of determination. "I will not be a victim of your prejudices and hatred." Cartwright just chuckled, his laugh sounding like the cracking of brittle ice. He opened the door and stepped out, leaving her in the car as if she were just an object he could do whatever he wanted with. "Look," he said, turning to the crowd that was still watching. "This woman just thinks she can game the system. She can try to tell me I'm wrong, but no one's going to listen to her. You're all here to have fun, and I'm just doing my job." Nia felt anger boiling up inside her. She wanted to get out of the car and show him that she wasn't just a spectator in this situation, but as soon as she tried to open the door, she realized that she was locked out. "Are you going to sit here and say nothing?" Cartwright shouted when he came back to her. His voice was full of mockery. "You can't even defend yourself. If it weren't for your diploma, no one would pay attention to you." "I will not listen to your insults," she said, but her voice was already beginning to shake with tension. "I am here to fight for the truth, and you cannot silence me." Cartwright leaned closer, his face dark and menacing. He placed his hand on the roof of the car and leaned toward Nia as if he was about to whisper something intimate to her, but in reality his words sounded like an insult. "You're nothing. Your status means nothing when it comes to real power. You, a black woman, simply don't have a chance. My patrol buddies and I will always be here to remind you of that." Nia felt a fire ignite inside her. This wasn't just an insult. This was a reflection of the entire system that had worked against her, all the hatred that had been ignored for so long. She couldn't let it go unanswered. "You're wrong," she said, her voice growing even more confident. "I'm not just a black woman. I'm a prosecutor, and I know my rights. I'm going to fight for justice, even if it means I have to do it alone." Cartwright threw his head back and laughed, his laugh sounding like mockery. "Pfft, fight for justice? Ridiculous. he said, walking back to his car. You, a black woman, will remember this day. This is your lesson. The system is not on your side, and you know it. The crowd around them murmured quietly, and Nia felt her support begin to fade. People were afraid, and it weighed on her like an extra burden. She realized that she had to be a voice not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced such humiliation. I can't do this alone, she whispered to herself, but a fire of determination burned in her heart. I will fight. I will stand for what is right. As if in response to her inner challenge, one of the men from the crowd, seeing her desperate look, came closer. We're with you, Nia, he said, and there was sincerity in his voice. We won't let them break you. As if in response to his support, Nia felt a surge of strength once again. She knew that the fight was not only for her, but for those around her, and even as Cartwright continued to insult her, she knew that she had to remain steadfast. You will not break me, she said, her voice a challenge. I am here to stand for what is right, and you will not intimidate me. Cartwright turned to the crowd and shouted, Get out, you don't belong here, you won't help her in any way. But his words only roused the people, and they began chanting her name, raising their hands in support. Nia felt hope ignite within her. She was not alone, even in this terrible ordeal. Cartwright, seeing his power begin to crumble, leaned towards Nia again, his face becoming even more vicious. You're not getting away this time, he said, his voice threatening. You're a victim of the system, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Nia felt her heart skip a beat. She knew the situation could end badly, but there was a fire burning inside her that no one could put out. She was ready to fight for herself and for those who remained in the shadows. I'm not a victim, she screamed, her voice growing stronger. I will fight. As Nia stepped out of the patrol car, she felt a fire of determination burning in her heart. This incident was not only a personal affront, but also a symbol of the fight for justice. Now she had to take responsibility not only for her own fate, but for everyone who suffered from bias and racism. A few weeks after the incident, Nia decided she would sue Cartwright and the police department. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The system was against her, and Cartwright had his allies, but she was ready to fight. Having collected all the necessary documents, she stood in front of the mirror and looked at her reflection. Her eyes reflected not only excitement, but also confidence. She understood that her case was not just a fight for her name, but also an opportunity to change something in the system. Nia felt the tension building in the courthouse. The loud footsteps of the judge's office and the whispers of the lawyers mixed with her inner dread. She knew Cartwright would be there, and his presence filled her with cold dread, but she also knew this was her chance. She walked into the courtroom with her head held high, despite her inner hesitation. Nia's lawyer, an experienced woman named Melanie, approached her. Remember, Nia, you are not alone, she said, her voice full of support. We will fight for your truth. As the hearing began, Nia saw Cartwright sitting there with a confident smirk. His composure seemed provocative to her, and it only fueled her anger. She couldn't let this man win again. The first part of the trial was tense. The prosecution tried to paint Nia as incompetent, exaggerating her actions on that fateful day. Nia felt the defense attorney's words like hammer blows to her dignity, and every line made her want to stand up and scream, "That's not true!" Finally, it was her turn to testify. Nia stood up and took a deep breath as she stepped toward the stand. She felt everyone's eyes on her, and it gave her strength. Squeezing her hands tightly to keep from shaking, she began to tell her story. I was arrested for no reason, she said, her voice confident. I'm a prosecutor, and I know how the law works. I'm not a criminal, and I shouldn't have been in this situation. Every word she spoke was filled with emotion, and she saw some of the people in the room begin to listen to her more attentively. She continued to talk about how the police officer had shown no respect for her status and how his bias and hatred had depressed her. This isn't just my personal fight, she said proudly. This is the fight of all those who face injustice, who face prejudice. We can't let the system continue to act as if we were second-class citizens. Looking out into the room, Nia noticed a few people who had come to support her. They were standing in the back rows, their faces shining with hope. It gave her strength. As her testimony drew to a close, the defense attorney began asking questions, seeking to undermine her confidence. Are you sure you weren't trying to avoid arrest? He asked, his tone dismissive. Didn't you try to challenge the officer? Nia felt anger filling her, but she knew she had to stay calm. "I wasn't trying to challenge," she said, her voice taking on a new determination. "I was defending my rights. I'm a prosecutor, and I have a right to know why I'm being detained." The hearing continued, and Nia, despite the pressure, continued to fight. Her lawyer brought witnesses who backed up her claims. People from the crowd that day came out in support, and their testimonies of racism and bias only strengthened her case. Nia felt her strength grow, and she knew that with each witness, their cause was getting stronger. People were beginning to understand that this wasn't just her fight, but a fight for everyone who had ever faced a similar situation. When it was time for the closing arguments, Nia felt the entire atmosphere in the courtroom turn tense. She walked up to the podium one last time, her heart pounding, but now it was not from fear, but from determination. "I don't stand here just as a black woman," she said. "I stand here as a prosecutor, as a voice for those who have been oppressed. This case is just one of many manifestations of racism and bias in our system. We must fight for change, for justice." Her words resonated in the hearts of those present. She knew that with every word she spoke she was getting closer to victory, and her speech was not just an attempt to prove herself right, but also a call for change. As the trial drew to a close and the judge retired to make his decision, Nia felt her heart beat in unison with the hope that hung in the air. She knew it wasn't over yet, but she had already taken a step toward justice. A few days later, when the court's decision was announced, Nia waited with bated breath for her name to be called. The judge pronounced the decision, and Nia felt anxiety brewing inside her until he spoke the words that would change her life forever. "The court finds that Officer Cartwright's actions were wrongful and biased," the judge said, and applause broke out in the courtroom. Nia felt tears of joy well up in her eyes. This was not just her personal triumph, but a victory for everyone who had ever faced racism and injustice. "We did it," she whispered, knowing that her fight had not been in vain. She knew that this was only the beginning. Now that she had won this cause, her voice was louder, and she could continue to fight for those who could not. This victory wasn't just about challenging one arrest. It was the beginning of a movement that would change the system. Nia knew she would continue to fight for justice, for the rights of black women and anyone who needed protection from bias. Now she was not only a prosecutor, but also a symbol of hope, a symbol of the fight for equality and justice that would inspire others for many years to come. After the judge made his decision, Officer Cartwright's life began to change rapidly. He had always seemed confident in his power, but now he had to face the consequences of his actions. At first he couldn't believe what had happened. The judge's words echoed in his mind. Officer Cartwright's actions were unlawful and biased. Those words cut him like a knife. He had grown accustomed to impunity, to having his actions never questioned, but now everything was different. Cartwright returned home with an empty heart. His wife, noticing the change in his behavior, asked him what was wrong. He answered briefly, trying to hide his emotions. "It's okay," he said, but his voice trembled with irritation and shame. Nia's words wouldn't leave him. He heard her talk about justice, about fighting for her rights, and it tormented him. He couldn't even remember the last time he felt so vulnerable. A few days after the decision was announced, Cartwright received notice of an internal investigation being launched against him. The news hit him like lightning. He never imagined his actions would provoke such a reaction. At work, his colleagues began to behave differently. Some avoided his gaze, others whispered quietly. He felt judged. One day, when he walked into the station, one of the new police officers to whom he had once given advice looked at him disapprovingly. "You should have known we had rules," he said, turning away from him. The words seemed to cut him. The internal investigation was a nightmare. Every step he took was scrutinized. Cartwright was called in for questioning, asked about his methods and why he hadn't shown respect to Nay that day. He tried to justify himself, but his excuses were increasingly unconvincing. His own words seemed hollow to him when he talked about his job. Cartwright felt more and more isolated. He had lost the support of his colleagues. His reputation within the department had taken a hit. Even at home, there was tension. His wife increasingly asked him if he wanted to quit the force to move to another area. She didn't understand the impact it had on his life, on his pride. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, he returned home to find her sitting on the couch with a sad expression on her face. She looked at him with sympathy. "You can't go on like this," she said. "You've changed. And I don't know who you are now." The words pierced him. He had always considered himself a man of justice, a defender of the law. How could he become the one at the center of a scandal? How could he lose himself in this struggle for power? His service began to suffer, and soon the official notice arrived. Cartwright was suspended from duty. This blow was the last straw for him. He did not know how to go on living, not knowing what to do without his police star. Thoughts of revenge crept into his mind. He believed that Nia had to answer for what she had done to his career, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it was his actions that had led to this situation. He could not run away from his responsibility. When he met his former colleagues, they began to discuss Nia's case as a precedent. Some praised her for her courage, others expressed displeasure that their work was now in question. This depressed Cartwright even more. He realized that his former power no longer mattered. His days became tedious. He often woke up in the middle of the night, remembering how Nia stood before the judgment, holding her head high. These images became his punishment, his inner judgment, which he could not escape. He thought a lot about how she could gain such power, while he himself was in the abyss. Finally, after several months, Cartwright decided to seek help from a psychologist. He realized that his behavior was not just a mistake, it was a reflection of the entire system in which he had grown up, all the biases that he had not noticed until now. In the first session, he had difficulty articulating his thoughts. The psychologist asked him questions, and with each answer, he became increasingly aware that his hatred and prejudice were rooted in fear of losing power, fear of those who were different from him. "I don't know how to fix my mistakes," he said, and there was sincerity in his voice. "I don't know how to live with what I've done." The psychologist suggested he start small, studying racism and bias and how they impact society. It was a long journey, and Cartwright knew he had to take it to restore his humanity and change his worldview. With each session, he became increasingly aware that his actions were not just individual, but part of a larger problem affecting the entire society. He began to learn to listen, understand and accept the diversity that surrounded him. Meanwhile, Nia continued her work as a prosecutor, but with renewed determination. She knew that her voice had become an important tool in the fight for rights and justice. She organized a group working to change racial discrimination laws, and her influence on the community continued to grow. Nia and Cartwright's fates were intertwined, and although they walked different paths, their stories intersected in their search for justice and change. Cartwright realized that it was important for him to not just change his attitude, but to seek redemption for his actions, and Nia continued to inspire others to fight for their rights. Each had their own struggle, but their paths might cross again someday. They both became symbols of change, one of personal transformation, and the other of the fight for justice and equality. Despite Cartwright's best efforts to sort out his emotions and try to change himself, vengeful thoughts continued to take over his mind. Every time he remembered Nia standing at the podium, defending her rights, his anger flared up with renewed vigor. He felt like he had lost everything: the respect of his colleagues, his job, and most importantly, his pride. A vengeful idea began to slowly grow in his mind like a sinister seed, and he could not get rid of it. One day, sitting in his dark office, he began to formulate a plan. Cartwright knew that Nia was still working as a prosecutor, and that her cases often intersected with those involving the police. He decided that he could use his former power and connections to hurt her. It would be revenge, and the justifying thoughts echoed in his mind. "She did this to me, so why shouldn't I do the same?" Cartwright began gathering information about Nia and her cases. He used his access to the database to study her past cases, finding weaknesses and vulnerabilities that he could use against her. Each time he found new information, his hatred and gloating only grew. He wanted to make her look incompetent, which he believed would be an excuse for her to defeat him in court. Once he had collected enough material, Cartwright took action. He knew that many of the cases Nia handled involved police misconduct, and he decided to create false evidence that would tarnish her reputation. He forged documents, adding false evidence that Nia was involved in corruption schemes that allegedly involved several police brutality cases. Cartwright used his connections to leak this information to the media, hoping to stir up public outrage. His plan was to make it appear that Nia was using her position to protect her cop girlfriends, allowing criminals to escape justice. Nia's alleged crimes began appearing on the local news. Cartwright felt a wave of satisfaction. He watched her reaction when she saw her picture on the front page of the newspaper with the headline, "Prosecutor Colluding with Corrupt Cops." She was in shock and couldn't believe what was happening. Meanwhile, Nia began to conduct her own investigation, trying to find out where this information came from. She knew that it could be someone's evil doing, but she had no idea that Cartwright was behind it all. Every day was a struggle for her. She assembled a team of lawyers to prepare to defend her reputation. Every step she took strengthened her resolve. Nia knew her name was on the line, and she had to prove her innocence. Meanwhile, Cartwright continued to enjoy his small triumph. Although he was also troubled internally, he knew that his actions could have serious consequences, and that his revenge could be turned against him. However, the desire to regain respect and power clouded his mind. As each day went by, Nia's investigation deepened. She became more and more certain that someone was trying to frame her. Her intuition told her that this was connected to her arrest, and that this was all part of a larger scheme. She sent a request to Internal Affairs to find out if there were any anonymous sources who might be connected to her case. When Nia was confronted with the results of the investigation, she realized that her suspicions were justified. The fake documents that were sent to the media contained errors that could only be linked to one person, Cartwright. Now Nia had a new focus. She had to gather evidence against him. She realized that Cartwright, as a police officer, had access to resources and information that could ruin her career. Nia decided to act decisively and turned to her lawyer for advice. "We need to catch him in the act," she said, her voice confident. "We need to document everything he does." With the help of her allies, Nia began gathering evidence of his malicious actions. She organized surveillance on him, using her connections to find out how and when he planned to act next. Her team was determined to expose Cartwright and bring justice. While Cartwright continued to immerse himself in his plans for revenge, Nia prepared for a battle that could change not only their lives, but the entire city. She knew that this fight would not just be personal, but symbolic, a fight for truth, for justice, and for those who suffer from systemic injustice. Every step she took brought her closer to the moment when they would meet face to face, and Nia was ready to fight. She knew it would be a tough fight, but her resolve was unwavering. She could not let this man, Cartwright, ruin her life and the lives of so many others who were victims of racial discrimination and prejudice. The conflict between them was heating up, and both sides were preparing for a decisive clash. Each of them knew that the stakes were high, and their actions would determine not only the future of their lives, but also the fate of those who looked to them with hope for change. Cartwright, lost in his vengeful thoughts, began to formulate a more detailed plan that would finally break Nia and put her reputation in doubt. He realized that simply forging documents was not enough. To make his revenge truly effective, he needed to create a real threat that would convince everyone that Nia was not trustworthy. Cartwright continued to use his police connections to gather information on Nia and her colleagues. He learned that she was working on several cases related to police brutality and noticed that there were some officers in these cases who he suspected could be connected to corruption. He decided to use this to his advantage. He found a way to gain access to Nia's personal correspondence and her emails. Cartwright installed spyware on her work computer when she was in a meeting, and now he could monitor her every move. He looked for mentions of police officers who could be his allies and looked for an opportunity to create the illusion of collusion. Cartwright knew he had to create false evidence that would implicate Nia in the corruption scheme. He began working on creating fake emails and text messages that would appear to be from Nia and would be sent to various police officers. These messages would contain references to illegal activities and information being exchanged between them. He also decided to create fake testimonies, eyewitnesses, that would confirm that Nia was using her position to cover up the crimes of her colleagues. Cartwright contacted several old acquaintances from his police days who were willing to help him with this. He promised them financial assistance in exchange for false testimony. The next step in his plan was to incriminate Nia at a public event. He learned of an upcoming press conference at which Nia was going to discuss her work on police brutality cases. Cartwright planned to stage the event so that fake witnesses would appear at the event who would accuse Nia of covering for her police friends. He arranged a meeting with two men he knew from his circle and explained his idea to them. They were supposed to show up at a press conference and ask Nia provocative questions, pointing out her alleged connections to police officers involved in crimes. Cartwright also planned to record this on video to post online and cause public outrage. Cartwright knew that simple accusations might not work if Nia was able to defend herself. He decided to create conditions for an escalation of the conflict, so that the public would become even more opposed to her. He began spreading rumors that Nia allegedly worked for criminal groups, manipulating police officers to achieve their goals. To do this, he created fake accounts on social media and began spreading these rumors, presenting them as insider information. His goal was to create a public opinion that would accuse Nia of corruption and treason. To complete the plot, Cartwright planned to create an incident that would completely discredit Nia. He planned to call the police to her address, claiming that she was involved in criminal activity. He planned to do this at a time when Nia would be in full view of the media and the public, so as to highlight her unacceptable behavior as much as possible. Cartwright was sure that this would lead to her arrest and her ignominious fall from office as prosecutor. He dreamed of her standing in handcuffs, seeing him in the crowd, and feeling like his revenge had finally been fulfilled. But deep down, he was tormented by doubts. He knew that this plan could have consequences beyond his control. He increasingly thought that perhaps revenge was not the right thing to do, and that his revenge might not end the way he had imagined. But his anger and sense of betrayal were stronger, and he continued to move forward, not realizing that retribution was inevitable. Each new step led him deeper into dark waters, and he seemed unable to stop. He knew that everything could eventually turn against him, but for now, revenge was his only goal. At this point, Cartwright did not realize that his own life and career were also on the brink of destruction. When it came time for the press conference, Cartwright was on cloud nine. He had planned everything meticulously: fake documents, false witnesses, and rumors that spread on social media. He arrived early, watching Nia, who seemed confident and ready to share her work. As the press conference began, Cartwright, hidden behind a crowd of reporters, waited for the right moment to introduce his fake witnesses. He knew he had to wait until Nia began to talk about her successes in fighting police brutality. He took a deep breath when two of his accomplices, posing as ordinary citizens, raised their hands and asked her provocative questions, accusing her of favoring corrupt cops. "Why don't you investigate your colleagues' actions?" one of them asked, his voice full of discontent. "We're told that all you do is cover for them." But Nia was not taken aback. She responded calmly, confidently citing facts and statistics that refuted the accusations. Knowing that her reputation was at stake, she conducted this part of the press conference with such determination that even the journalists began to support her. This was not Cartwright's plan, and his pulse quickened with fear. But he wasn't about to give up. As Nia began to crack the questions, Cartwright signaled his accomplices to act. The video they had prepared appeared on the screen, a fake testimony about Nia accepting bribes from the police. But to his horror, when the recording started, her voice didn't sound the way he had planned. Nia immediately recognized the video and pounced on the accusations. She looked at the audience, and her confidence only grew. She presented evidence that the video was doctored, showing original documents and emails on the screen that proved her case. Nia did everything she could to demonstrate that Cartwright and his associates were involved. The general atmosphere at the press conference changed. Nia took the opportunity to address the assembled journalists. "You have to ask yourself who is really here for the truth, and who is trying to hide it. This is not just my fight. This is a fight for justice for all of us." The assembled reporters, amazed by her resilience, began asking questions about the false accusations and why Cartwright was the one trying to discredit her. Cartwright couldn't believe his ears as his own words and actions came back to haunt him. He felt his confidence slipping from under him as reporters began to probe why his accusations didn't match up with reality. Meanwhile, Nia decided to take action. She contacted Internal Affairs and filed a report to investigate Cartwright. She had evidence that he had used his authority to create false evidence and try to discredit her. Thanks to her determination and courage, the case quickly gained momentum. The investigator who took over the case quickly responded to her statement. He soon assembled a team that began investigating Cartwright's actions using the evidence Nia had collected. They quickly found evidence that Cartwright had indeed been forging documents and using his position of authority for his own vengeful ends. Ultimately, Nia and her team were able to convince the prosecutor to file a criminal case against Cartwright. The trial was a stormy one. Nia stood at the podium, confident as she laid out all the facts that proved Cartwright's wrongdoing. Her presentations were full of emotion and truth, and soon the public saw her as a true champion of justice once again. Cartwright, on the other hand, knew from the dock how quickly his plan had fallen apart. Every new piece of evidence, Every new piece of evidence against him only gave Nia and her team more confidence. Ultimately, the court found him guilty of abuse of power and forgery. He was sentenced and sent to prison, where he would have difficult days of realizing his mistakes. Nia finally felt the pressure lift. Her fight had not only cleared her name, but it had also helped many others who had been victims of police brutality. She knew this was just the beginning and there was still a lot of work ahead, but she was now confident in her strength and determination. Every step she took brought her closer to changing the system and restoring justice. Cartwright, sitting in his prison cell, reflected on how his plans for revenge had backfired on him, and how perhaps revenge had not been what he had really wanted. Now, away from his old life, he began to realize how destructive hatred and prejudice could be. Sitting in his prison cell, Cartwright felt the loneliness slowly creeping up on him. The walls around him were cold and soulless, and the sounds from the hallways only served to highlight his isolation. Every day spent behind bars was a reminder of how quickly and cruelly his life had changed. He had lost everything: his career, his respect, his friends, and most importantly, his freedom. In the evenings, when silence enveloped his cell, he often thought back to his life before his arrest, how he had once been proud of his work, confidently dispensing justice, how he had protected his community and felt on top of the world. But now, looking at the ceiling, he realized that all of these accomplishments had been overshadowed by his vengeful actions. He thought about Nia. She had been so determined and strong when she stood up to him. Her confidence and dedication to justice now filled him with admiration as well as anger. Cartwright wondered how she had been able to withstand his attacks so well and not crack under the pressure. He knew that despite all his attempts to discredit her, she had remained true to her beliefs and had not given in. Was it all worth it? He agonized over his actions. He remembered how he had behaved the day he had arrested Nia. Brutal, ruthless, full of self-righteousness. At the time, he had thought he was defending his pride, his reputation, but now he realized that it was precisely this pride and prejudice that had led to his failure. He realized that he had not been fighting for the truth, but for his own vengeful ambitions. Every time he heard the screams of prisoners or saw the guards passing by, he knew that he could never return to the life that had once seemed perfect to him. He asked himself, was I ever really right? All his actions, all his decisions now seemed like attempts to hide his own fears and complexes. He also realized that his revenge had not only ruined his life, but had also made Nia stronger. She had become a symbol of the fight for justice, and this greatly undermined his own ambitions. How could I not have seen this before? He asked himself, thinking about how his own hatred and desire for revenge had turned against him. With each passing day in prison, Cartwright realized that true strength came not from revenge, but from the ability to forgive and learn from one's mistakes. He dreamed of perhaps one day being released and being able to start over, but now he had no illusions about how difficult it would be to rebuild his life. He thought more and more about how he could change his behavior. He wanted to be able to tell Nia that he knew he was wrong and that he was ashamed of his actions, but he knew that his words would not bring back lost time, and that he would have to take responsibility for his actions. The nights grew longer and his thoughts became clearer. He realized that this period in prison was not just a punishment, but an opportunity to rethink his life and understand what was truly important. He dreamed of one day being able to correct his mistakes, even if it was difficult. But deep down, he knew that to do this, he had to change himself. His time in prison was a real test for him, and he hoped that in the end, it would be his chance for redemption. Despite all his thinking and desire to change, Cartwright knew that life would not be kind to those who made mistakes. His trial was brief but brutal. He heard the cold-voiced judge pronounce the sentence that would be the final nail in the coffin of his freedom. Your hatred and abuse of power cannot be forgiven. The judge's words rang out, and they resonated in Cartwright's mind like a chime. He knew this wasn't just a punishment, but an answer for his actions. The prosecutor Nia had worked with had brought forth numerous testimonies about how his actions had harmed not only her, but many others. Cartwright had seen people he had once considered colleagues testifying against him, and the sense of betrayal was unbearable. The judge handed down a sentence, 3 years in prison, eligible for parole after 2 years, provided Cartwright completed rehabilitation and self-improvement, but those 2 years felt like an eternity. He spent every day in prison, lost in thought about how he had gotten to this point in his life. He watched other prisoners walk out on their own, overcoming their problems, and he knew his path would be much more thorny. Cartwright thought about Nia often. Her tenacity and determination were a reminder to him that she had been able to overcome all the challenges and come out on top. He envied her, but also understood that it was her struggle that had brought him to this point. Why didn't I see this before? He asked himself over and over. Cartwright realized that true strength came not from revenge, but from admitting your mistakes and trying to be a better person. But in prison, he knew his road to redemption would be long and difficult. Every day his desire to change grew stronger, but he knew that he had to answer for his actions, and although he dreamed of seeing freedom again one day, he also understood that this was only the beginning. He would have to go through many trials to restore not only his life, but also his soul. Cartwright began writing his thoughts in the notebooks given to prisoners. It became his therapy, his only way to express his feelings and try to figure out what he could do to become a better person. He was searching for an answer to the question, could he ever atone for his sins and become the man he had once been admired for? And while prison became a symbol of punishment for him, it also became a place where he could begin his inner journey. Every time he heard sounds coming from the corridors, laughter, shouts, conversations, he knew that life went on, and he would have to find his way back to this world. It took him several months to realize that time was not an enemy, but a teacher. He began to work on himself, studying the books that fell into his hands and talking to other prisoners who were also looking for forgiveness. He understood that the path to redemption would not be easy, but he was ready to take it. With each passing day, Cartwright became more and more aware that justice would take time, and although he didn't know when he would be released, he knew he was ready to fight for it. Nia's life, like Cartwright's, changed dramatically after the incident, but in a completely different direction. When she was released after winning the case, it was not easy, but she felt that she had taken a step toward justice. Nia became a symbol of hope for many. Her story made headlines, and she received support from many organizations fighting for human rights and social justice. With each passing day, her life became filled with new opportunities. She began speaking at conferences to share her story, and soon media outlets began approaching her for interviews. Nia realized that her voice had become an important tool in the fight against racism and police brutality. She felt that it was her mission to protect those who could not protect themselves and to help those who were facing similar challenges. But fame didn't come without its challenges. Nia became a target of criticism, her life once again in the crosshairs. She received threatening messages from people who didn't want her voice heard, but each time she faced negativity, her resolve only grew stronger. She knew her story was important, and that she needed to continue fighting for justice. To better cope with the new information flow and manage her time, Nia started a small charity that focused on helping victims of police violence. She recruited colleagues and friends who shared her passion for change. The foundation became a place where people could receive legal assistance, psychological support, and human rights training. Despite the challenges she faced along the way, Nia felt more confident and empowered than ever. She began working with various human rights organizations, participating in workshops and public discussions that addressed issues of racism, police violence, and justice. Every time she took the stage to speak, she saw hope and support in the faces of the audience. These moments gave her the strength to continue. Over time, Nia realized that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a woman who had been the victim of injustice. She was now a fighter for human rights and justice. She signed a book deal to tell her story, and in the process, she was finding new connections and opportunities. Despite all her successes, Nia never forgot what had happened. Every time she met people who were going through similar difficulties, her heart filled with compassion and understanding. She couldn't change what happened to her, but she could use her knowledge and experience to help others. In the end, she became not only the face of the fight for human rights, but also a strong woman who inspired many to continue the fight for justice. Nia knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but she was ready for it. Every new day was an opportunity to change the world for the better, and she was determined not to back down until justice was served. It's been a few years since Nia won her first court case. In that time, she's become a well-known figure in the world of human rights activism. Her book, which tells her personal story, became a bestseller, inspiring people across the country. Not only has Nia shared her story, but she's also used it as a platform to discuss important issues like racism and police brutality. Each new speech and publication strengthened her position as an opinion leader and advocate for justice. Nia saw society change. More people began to recognize the problems she faced, and more people joined the fight for change. But Nia also knew that the journey to true justice was not over. She continued her work with the foundation, helping victims of police violence find support and legal help. Each new case she helped resolve confirmed her belief that change was possible, and that every little effort counts. Meanwhile, Cartwright continued his life in prison, facing the consequences of his actions. His path to redemption was difficult, and he realized that all this time he was fighting not only with Nia, but also with himself. Every morning he woke up thinking about how wrong he was, and hoping that he could one day clear his name. One day, as part of a rehabilitation program, he was given the opportunity to write a letter to the victim to express his apologies. He thought long and hard before taking this step, but in the end, his heart demanded that he acknowledge his mistakes. He wrote to Nia about how sorry he was for his actions and how they had changed his life. In this letter, Cartwright sincerely asked for forgiveness and expressed his hope that perhaps he could contribute to change in society after his release. Nia received the letter and her heart began to beat faster. She knew that forgiveness was not only a way to free others, but also a way to free herself. After much thought, she decided to respond, not to justify his actions, but to show that true strength lies in forgiveness and understanding. When Cartwright was finally released, he felt like a changed man. He knew there were still many obstacles to overcome on his path to redemption, but he was willing to work on himself. Inspired by Nia's letter and her strength, he decided to volunteer for an organization that fights police violence to make up for his past mistakes. Nia and Cartwright met at a public event dedicated to human rights. It was a difficult meeting, full of emotions and expectations. Nia looked into Cartwright's eyes and saw not only a man who had made a mistake, but also a man who was striving for change. Their conversation became a symbol of the importance of forgiveness and how powerful change can be when we are open to new possibilities. Thus, two destinies, once intertwined in conflict and pain, now united in the pursuit of peace and justice. Nia continued her work inspiring others, and Cartwright began his journey of redemption, recognizing that every step was a chance to make the world a better place. They both knew there was much work to do, but with determination and a willingness to embrace change, they could create a future where equality and justice were a reality for all. Nia and Cartwright's story ended, but their lessons and their quest for justice lived on in the hearts of many. Nia continued to inspire and support people, and Cartwright, despite his past, sought ways to help others and correct his mistakes. Their paths, though they began with conflict and pain, led to understanding, forgiveness, and the possibility of change. This story reminds us all of the importance of fighting for justice and that even the darkest moments can lead to bright changes. In the end, every opportunity. What do you think is the most important lesson we can learn from Nia and Cartwright's story? What do you think is key in the forgiveness process? Can you imagine yourself in Nia's shoes? What steps do you think need to be taken to achieve justice in our society? Why is it important to talk about issues of racism and police violence? How can we use our voices to make change? How do you feel about the idea that even those who have made mistakes can change and make a positive contribution to society? What actions can you take to support justice and equality in your community? What do you think about the role of personal responsibility in a person's life? How does this reflect on Cartwright's story? Dear viewers, we sincerely want to hear your opinion about our story. Write in the comments what you think about Nia and Cartwright. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Every word you say is very important to us, and it is you who make our channel so special. We deeply appreciate your support and participation. You become part of this important dialogue, and without you we would not be able to share stories like these. Your thoughts and feelings mean more to us than you can imagine. Don't forget to subscribe and like our channel to continue this important work with us. Thank you for being with us and we wish you a fantastic day. Your presence makes our project better.